Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Journal Club. We're in September, so it's time to pull out a couple more articles. I got 2 articles hot off the press for you today. First one is about sprinting and hamstring strength, so we're going to talk about that and injury and how those things kind of relate together. And then we're going to switch gears and talk more psychology route. We're going to talk about stress, arousal, and how we can kind of change our perception, if we can change our perception of stress, challenge, and threat when it comes to pre-competition anxiety. So let's dive right in. The first article we're going to dive right into is called The Influence of Weekly Sprint Volume and Maximal Velocity Exposures on Eccentric Hamstring Strength in Professional Football. And as always, if you want to read these, you can find them in the description. I've packed the links in the citation, authors' names, everything you need to know down there. So in football, as you probably guessed, 95+% of injuries are going to be musculoskeletal. That means maybe 5-ish% are concussions or neurological or something else, but the majority are going to be musculoskeletal. It makes sense in football also that the lower body is going to be affected more. And indeed, hamstring issues are absolutely a thing in football. Sprinting is also responsible for 50% of the hamstring issues that happen in football. And that's why this study is so important, because we want to understand why exactly that is the case and what we can potentially do to avoid that in training and managing our load. When we're in that eccentric contraction in sprinting, if the external forces are too great, we're going to have a serious problem if they don't match up to our muscular capacity. So if we're not strong enough to hold up against this external force, we're going to have issues. You probably guessed some of the risk factors already just from me saying that. Yeah, being too weak. Having muscular asymmetries between legs, like having a hamstring that's wicked strong and another one that's extremely weak. It's totally normal to have asymmetries, like small differences between strength or length, but having big asymmetries can be a problem. We also look at quad to hamstring strength ratio, like if the quads are extremely strong and the hamstrings are weak, have never been trained before, that's an injury risk. An incomplete warm-up is always an injury risk, regardless of the sport, but definitely in this case, if you just go sprint not being completely warm, hit a max velocity sprint and you're gonna be sorry tomorrow. And probably longer than that. Another one is lack of flexibility. If you can't actually get into the position that you need to be in, it's really hard to gain strength there, and especially to gain power. And then you're gonna add power on top of something where you can't get into that position, you're asking for an injury. Interestingly enough, previous research has also strongly suggested that injury rates are 9 times higher in competition, so in match play as opposed to in training. So this has something to do with the intensity. Now in sports science, we also often tend to simplify this and just to automatically think that the distance that we're running is going to have the biggest impact on our hamstrings and put us up for an injury risk. And this specific paper is looking into that. Like, it might actually come down to the total distance covered, like total volume, and also your readiness, and not necessarily the output, the intensity, the distance per sprint rep. So essentially this article is saying we might have this specific thing like sprint and hamstrings a little oversimplified. Let's get a little more nuanced. So they took 58 professional football players, and they were all field players, so no keepers, sorry. A portion was measured over a season and a half. The other portion was then measured over a season. They were then sorted by position. So you had your defenders, you had your attackers, etc. And their movement was then monitored by GPS. So in training 3 times a week, in match play, they had their GPS on, and that's how they were able to track their sprint performance. The other thing they did, because the study is specifically looking at the injury risk of eccentric hamstring strength, is they used Nordboard testing. So they used a Nordic hamstring curl, 3 repetitions on match day +2. So there were several inverse relationships here, meaning that one was low and the other one was high. Because one is low, the other one is going to be higher. Because one is high, the other one's going to be low. They're opposites. So they found this with weekly sprint distance and the percentage change in hamstring strength, which again they measured with the Nordboard, as well as total weekly efforts at 90+%, not 95+, not 100%. They were using 90% for sprints, and percentage change in strength. Let's dive into it. Effort. What they found is over the course of tracking match play and training, there were limited efforts over 95%. And in sports science, we often think to get hamstring resilience, to sprint well, we need to be sprinting at 100%. For these football players, they essentially found that very few actually happen over 95%. In total, 0.02% of all of the sprints, 14 in total. Keep in mind that there were 58 players tracked over a season/a season and a half, and 14 total efforts were over 95% capacity. Here there was unfortunately too little information to find anything significant about eccentric hamstring strength. However, They found that this 95% is probably not applicable to football, and we should maybe be sticking to 90% efforts. That seems to be more applicable, more practical for our sport specifically. However, Gaelic football and other sports, 95% plus may still be good. It just doesn't seem to be super football applicable. Frequency is also interesting. How many repetitions of 90/95 plus do you need in a week? Now, seemingly optimal was 6 repetitions. As soon as they hit 7 repetitions, 8 repetitions, they found a significant decrease in hamstring force output, and that is not what we want. We want to keep that high. We want high quality reps when we're training. Now, as far as distance is concerned, like whether it's 20 meters, 30 meters, 50 meters, that seemed to be pretty irrelevant when it came down to eccentric hamstring strength. So they concluded that it's pretty likely that any spikes in external load, so like having a really high week or having a really heavy training day, is going to have more of an impact on injury risk than actually eccentric hamstring strength. So it seems like distance is pretty negligible for this specific factor. However, I'd like to point out, and the authors pointed this out as well, it was actually in all a really good study. Injury risk is hard to quantify. Like, we can't just break it down and say injury risk is just based on your eccentric hamstring strength, it's just based on torque this, it's just based on how much you can squat. Injury risk is very multifactorial, multidimensional. We have a lot of dimensions in there, so only talking about eccentric hamstring strength as a marker for injury risk, it's a marker, but it's not the whole thing. So as such, these results have to be taken with a grain of salt, because it could very well be that there's other injury risks that were not considered in this paper because they were specifically focused on eccentric hamstring strength. So treat these as isolated. It's not the full picture. It's only about the hams. 2 key points that we can take with us. 1, again, that 90% seems to really be the sweet spot. Not 95, not 100. We should be clocking athletes at about 90%. 6 repetitions, high quality, beautiful. As soon as we get to 7, or over 7, we're gonna have a problem. It seems that 6 repetitions keeps hamstring strength high, especially eccentric, and as soon as we get to 7, again, we're gonna have that problem where force output significantly decreases. We don't want that. We don't wanna get sloppy, and we don't wanna potentially raise our injury risk. So cap it at 6, high quality, at about 90% effort. I enjoyed the study. I think it does fill a valuable gap in the literature. When we're talking about injury risk, we just have to be careful that we're talking about it as a whole and not just the singular parts, but the study definitely pointed out that they were only looking at a specific part. So again, take this with a grain of salt. It's an isolated factor. Keep it in mind. It should improve our practice. It should help to make us better. It's just not giving us the entire picture. Let's switch gears. We're going to talk about sports psychology. This paper is called Adaptation to Stress in Football Athletes, the Importance of Cognitive Appraisal. This was published in Frontiers in Psychology, which is one of my personal favorite journals. Stress, one of my favorite topics ever. That's why we're talking about this. Something that we very often perceive as negative. It's not negative. Stress is entirely neutral. When it comes in our brain, though, we have a moment where we have to perceive. It's not always conscious. In fact, it's very often unconscious, and then we get this feeling of like, I'm threatened, stress, negative reaction, negative emotions, what's going on? So this paper is specifically focused on the various levels of appraisal that we go through, whether consciously or unconsciously, trying to make them more conscious so that we can develop better coping skills. So an appraisal is just an evaluation. We look at the situation. How are we going to deal with it? Do we have the resources to deal with it? What's going on here? And in our primary cognitive appraisal, which means the first one, we're having a look at whether this stressor, or for example, this match, is challenging, if it's threatening, if it's beneficial to us, if it's a loss or damage, like if we have absolutely no chance, or if it's completely benign or irrelevant. Obviously, if it's benign or irrelevant, we're probably not going to have much stress, but in the other ones, we're likely going to have some level of physiological arousal, whether or not we perceive it as inherently positive, negative, or neutral. We're also in this moment going to consider, like, who's in control of the event? Is there a benefit to me? What are the future expectations? What's the outlook looking like for me? These are all important things that we're considering, again, whether consciously or unconsciously. Now, if we perceive something as harmful or threatening, we're probably going to have negative emotions wrapped up in that. However, a challenge or a benefit is often perceived then positively because athletes like taking on a challenge or want to get after that benefit, of course. But a threat feels very close to us, it feels very dangerous, and that's going to be something that we perceive more negatively, even if that's not correct. Even if this scenario, we're not gladiators, this isn't football. It's not actually life-threatening, but it could be threatening to our egos, and in that sense, we still want to protect ourselves, so we still get the same reaction. This specific study wanted to look at a couple moderators, though, for this, such as competitive level, like how long have you been playing? More competitive athletes, we know from previous research, tend to have better coping skills that are more adaptive as opposed to maladaptive, so more positive as opposed to negative, actually. And then we also want to look at age, because younger kids are probably going to have less skills, but we also think that they have more fun participating in sports, but as soon as it becomes competitive, do they have the coping skills for that? Whereas older athletes, again, likely relating back to this competitive level, may have developed those skills already. So for this study, they had 352 football players, all male, and they took a U17 team and U19 team, so this is like between 15 and 19 years old. They then used 3 different questionnaires. So one of them to help identify sources of competitive stress, such as my readiness, any errors I'm gonna make, performance, social expectations, any injuries I have, how good the opponents are, or who the opponents are. The second questionnaire was then to better understand cognitive appraisal, which is specifically based on Lazarus, which is what this study is based around. The transactional model by Lazarus was more about the primary and secondary appraisals that we already talked about, such as threat perception, is competition actually disruptive and negative, challenge perception, and how important this thing is to us. Like if this match is super important and we perceive it as a threat, or do we perceive it as a challenge? That's what the second one was looking at. The third one was for emotional evaluation. And here we wanted to look at what's the response: anxiety, dejection, anger, excitement, happiness. How are they feeling? What they found was performance errors are actually the highest source of stress for these specific athletes. So the more stresses around the upcoming match, the more they perceived it as a threat, and they also perceived that they had less control over the outcome, and then therefore more negative emotions. So that's kind of like a bundle. So the higher the competitive stressor, the more threat perception, and the higher the negative emotions. That's consistent with previous research. On the other hand, also consistent with previous research, when they perceived it as a challenge, that predicted more positive emotions. It also predicted less negative emotions and more coping and control perceptions. So like, I got this, I have the resources, I can control what I need to control, and I can get through it. And that was our secondary appraisal. To the age and competition level considerations, super interesting. The U17 did indeed, so 15 to 17-year-olds, have more negative perceptions. So they had a negative evaluation of stress, meaning a higher threat, and decreased positive emotion, and decreased feelings of coping and control. So like, I have too little resources, I can't cope with this feels threatening to me, I'm stressed out, and then the negative emotions happen, of course. On the other hand, the U19, the 17 and 19-year-olds, they tended to view it as a challenge and thus had more coping skills, more control, and less feelings of threat. However, it's important to notice that this was only U17 and U19. This is not a huge age span, right? They're basically right next to each other in age. Would have loved to see this study with like a U12 team and a U19 team, or even U17 and U23, something like that, where we have more of an age range. Would also love to see sex differences, so female athletes to male athletes. I think that would be a little bit different. I don't think it's just linear according to age and how you develop your coping skills. And also competitive level, so from recreational to professional. Obviously, we know that there's a difference there. Recreational athletes tend to not having the coping skills that professional athletes have, but not all professional athletes have adequate coping skills for every level. However, this was a cross-sectional study, as the study itself admitted, which means we can't actually infer any causality. These are only correlations and associations that we're pulling out. But what's an important takeaway for me is that we can always reevaluate our competition. Is it a challenge? Is it a threat? Is it a positive? Is it a win? Is it completely benign and irrelevant for me? We can always look at it and review. We can always reappraise. What we can also do is develop coping skills for how we tend to appraise things. So if I tend to appraise things with, I have no control, I have no confidence, this is very negative and threatening, then I can look at specific coping mechanisms that are going to help me personally and adaptively get out of this, as opposed to maladaptively just swimming in this, oh my gosh, I can't control anything, this is going to be horrible. So my biggest takeaway is it's great that we can differentiate between challenge and threat perception. However, we also need to develop those coping mechanisms really adequately. That should be done throughout the ages. So if young players don't have those skills yet, then maybe we need to start younger talking about this, talking about that it's not threatening, that you're not going to lose anything, that you're not going to die, this isn't the end of the world. And here are the coping skills, so starting a little bit younger. I find that to be really important. Most things in sport are not life-threatening. So even if we perceive things as threat, we actually do have control and can work towards changing our mind and perceiving things more as a challenge as opposed to just a threat. It's completely possible. It's just something that we need to actively work towards. It won't happen without work. It won't happen unconsciously. It won't happen overnight. I hope these articles were helpful for you. They were helpful for me. If you have an article you'd like me to review in October, feel free to send it to me or put the DOI in the comments, and I'm happy to read it through for you. Thanks for listening. See you next time.